All right, let's dive into something pretty wild today. We're going to decode the secret slang of the late Soviet underground. This isn't just about weird words. It's a hidden language of rebellion, of fantasy, and honestly, of survival. It shows us how a whole generation built its own world right in the crux of a crumbling empire. So I've got a question for you. What could Soviet summer camps, people chanting in Elvish, and homemade meth possibly have in common? I know, it sounds like this setup to a really strange joke, but they're all connected. They were all pieces of a secret vocabulary that young people were using to carve out an identity for themselves in a world that was trying to force one on them. You see, this glossary we're about to explore, it's more than just a list of words. It's kind of like a map to a hidden culture, a culture that was bursting with creativity and resourcefulness, but also, at times, some really dangerous forms of escapism. This whole language was born right as the rigid Soviet system started to fall apart, and a new generation decided it was time to write their own rules. Okay, so to really get what they were rebelling against, we have to first understand the world they were living in. Our journey's going to start in the official, super-structured world that Soviet kids were supposed to just quietly fit into. And the main stage for this story is the Pionersky Lager, or the Pioneer Camp. Now, on the surface, it looks like any other summer camp, right? But underneath all the sing-alongs and bonfires, it was really a machine. A machine designed to churn out perfect little communists through a steady diet of party ideology. But here's where you start to see the cracks forming, even inside the official system. You had what they called red shifts, which were all in on patriotism and communist loyalty. But then you also had green shifts. These were more about nature, about ecology. And it was in these less controlled, kind of green spaces that the first little seeds of independence really started to sprout. And trust me, life was rigid. You had the Vojadi, the counselor, who was supposed to be your friend, but also your ideological watchdog. You were assigned to an othryad, your troop, and every single day kicked off with the Lineyka, a formal assembly, complete with roll calls and speeches, all designed to hammer home discipline. This was the world of rules they were itching to escape. So how did they pull it off? How'd they escape? Well, they built brand new, vibrant worlds using whatever scraps they could find from the old one. And this right here is where their creativity just explodes. For a lot of them, the ultimate escape hatch was live-action role-playing, or LARPing. Specifically, something called the Regional Niehobitskie Igre, the Regional Hobbit Games. See, books like The Lord of the Rings were floating around unofficially, and they opened up this portal to a whole other universe, a world of fantasy that was a powerful antidote to the gray, monotonous Soviet reality. Now, in a world where you couldn't just order stuff online, you had to make everything yourself, and their resourcefulness was just incredible. You need a warrior's mace to fight some orcs? No problem. You take a klushka, a regular old hockey stick, you add a plastic ring from a kid's toy, and boom, you are ready for battle. And their costumes were just as clever. That vatnik, a standard kind of cheap quilted worker's jacket, that becomes your armor. Those tough military work boots, the Kurzave sapogi, perfect footwear for an orc. And a big naval overcoat, the Morskaya Chanel, well, that's obviously a wizard's robe. They were absolute masters of transformation. And listen, this was not just a game of dress up. No way. Their commitment was on another level. You'd find them deep in the forests, singing chants in actual Elvish, straight out of Tolkien's books. They weren't just playing characters. For a whole weekend, they were those characters, living in a different world with its own history, its own language, and its own laws. And speaking of laws, these new worlds they built were governed by a completely different philosophy, a code that was a world away from Soviet doctrine. They called it Zakon Taigi, the law of the taiga. The idea was simple. Out here, in the massive wild forests, the rules of the state just didn't matter. What mattered was an unwritten honor code built on survival, on self-reliance, and on loyalty to your friends. It was the complete opposite of the top-down bureaucratic rules they lived with every other day. And how did they get to these little pockets of freedom? Their portal was the Elektrichka, the humble, everyday commuter train. For just a few coins, these packed, rattling trains would shuttle them away from the concrete cities and out into the wilderness. It was literally the bridge between their two lives. And, these gatherings were often fueled by a creative mix of drinks. You had your Soviet staples like the infamous 72 Portwein, a super cheap, super strong port wine, or you had pure ethanol, spirit, that you just dilute with whatever you could find. And then you had fantasy-inspired creations like Elbera Tovka, a homemade spice liquor named after an elvish goddess. I mean, their subculture seeped into everything, even what they drank. But building an alternate reality with elves and wizards, well, that wasn't the only way out. When you're up against a system that feels totally absurd and oppressive, you have two choices, right? You can build a beautiful new world to escape to, or you can just lean into the ugliness and reject the whole system. For another crowd, rebellion went down this much grittier, darker path. They created their own underbelly, where being an outcast was something you wore with pride. They actually called themselves the Partia Padankov, which translates to the Party of Scumbags. See, they didn't just want to escape the system, they wanted to confront it, to mock it. They took on this low-life identity as the ultimate act of defiance against the clean, orderly image of the perfect Soviet citizen. For this group, escape often took a much more chemical turn. And that, of course, came with a whole new slang. Vint was homemade meth. Cyclodol was a prescription drug that was widely abused. Phenazepam, a powerful benzo. And a Kosiak was a joint. It was another secret language, yeah, but this one was mapping out a much, much darker territory of rebellion. Their defiance was almost performance art. They had this thing they called the Alternativa. So if the government held some big, official, sanitized youth festival, the scumbags would set up their own chaotic, unsanctioned concert right next door. They were creating a parallel reality whose only purpose was to openly mock the official one. It was a perfect one-to-one rejection of the state's vision. So when you put it all together, from repurposed hockey sticks to elvish chants to dark drug slang, you realize this glossary was way more than just a list of words. It was the actual living, breathing sound of a generation building its own identity from the ground up. And that's really the heart of it all. In a world that demanded total conformity, language became the ultimate do-it-yourself tool. With just words, they built new communities, they built new codes of honor, and they built entirely new realities for themselves, whether that was in a fantasy forest or in a gritty city underpass. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. This was their glossary of rebellion and escape. And it really makes you wonder, what are the secret languages that we use today? What does our own slang, from internet memes to gaming terms, say about the worlds we might be trying to escape from and the new ones we're trying to build? Thanks for joining me.